The courtroom wasn't quiet. It was charged. The kind of tension that hums under the fluorescent lights and crawls beneath your skin. On the witness stand, 24-year-old Officer Michael Donovan shifted in his crisp, too-new uniform, trying and failing to steady his breath. Across the room, Judge Eleanor Vance watched him with a stillness that felt sharper than any accusation. She didn't need to raise her voice. Her presence alone was a verdict. This was the moment. The moment he wished he could outrun. Because just weeks earlier, under the glare of streetlights and his own unchecked anger, he hadn't seen her as a respected jurist, or even as a person. He saw a silhouette in a luxury sedan, a shoulder squared in confidence, a black woman he assumed was trouble. And he snapped. The memory hit him like a fist. His hands slamming her hood, his voice barking orders, her body shoved against cold metal she never deserved to feel. Now, facing the first black woman to ever lead the state's Supreme Court, the very woman he had pinned to her own car, Donovan felt the floor tilt beneath him. The prosecution wanted $10 million, but everyone in that courtroom knew. Michael Donovan was about to lose far more than money. The academy had been a blur of shouted commands, grueling physical tests, and the constant, throbbing pressure to be better, faster, stronger. Michael Donovan, fresh-faced and fueled by a legacy of law enforcement, had thrived in that environment. His father was a decorated detective, his grandfather a beat cop who'd walked the same city streets. The blue line wasn't just a career path, it was in his blood, a sacred trust passed down through generations. He'd memorized the penal codes, aced his firearms qualifications, and practiced takedown maneuvers until his muscles screamed in protest. But what they couldn't teach him, what no manual or simulation could ever prepare him for, was the dizzying, chaotic reality of the streets. His first few months on patrol were a whirlwind of noise and motion. The city, a place he'd known his whole life, transformed into a landscape of potential threats and hidden dangers. Every dark alley seemed to whisper a warning, every sudden movement a potential act of aggression. He was partnered with a veteran officer, a man named Henderson, whose weary cynicism was a constant, deflating presence in the patrol car. Henderson had a way of looking at the world, at the people they were sworn to protect, that chipped away at Donovan's idealism. He saw suspects, not citizens, perps, not people. And slowly, insidiously, Donovan started to see them too. He remembered one night, a domestic disturbance call in a run-down apartment building. The air was thick with the smell of stale cigarettes and despair. A woman with a bruised face and haunted eyes had opened the door, her husband a looming, belligerent presence behind her. Donovan had followed his training, his voice calm and authoritative as he tried to de-escalate the situation. But the man had lunged, not at his wife, but at him. The fight that followed was a chaotic explosion of flailing limbs and grunted curses. Donovan had ended up on top, his knee pressed into the man's back, the cold metal of the handcuffs a stark finality. He'd felt a surge of adrenaline, a primal satisfaction in restoring order. But later, as he'd filled out the report, the image of the woman's tear-streaked face had haunted him. She hadn't looked relieved. She had looked terrified. That night, back at the station, Henderson had clapped him on the shoulder. "You did good, kid," he'd said, his voice gruff. "You showed him who's in charge." But the words had felt hollow, a cheap consolation for the unease that had settled in Donovan's gut. Was that what this was all about? Showing people who was in charge? The incident with Judge Vance had started as a routine traffic stop. A black sedan, weaving slightly in its lane, had caught Donovan's attention. He'd flipped on his lights, the siren's wail a familiar, almost comforting sound. The car had pulled over, and Donovan had approached, his hand resting on the butt of his holstered Glock. He'd been on edge all day, a series of petty, frustrating calls leaving him feeling raw and exposed. When the driver, a black man in a tailored suit, had questioned the reason for the stop. Something in Donovan had bristled. He'd seen not a citizen exercising his rights, but a challenge to his authority. The man's calm, measured tone had felt like a mockery, his request for Donovan's badge number an act of defiance. He'd ordered the man out of the car, his voice sharper than he'd intended. The man had complied, but with a slowness that Donovan had interpreted as resistance. And then, in a split-second decision that would alter the course of both their lives, he had shoved the man against the car, his own reflection a distorted, angry mask in the polished black paint. He hadn't known, couldn't have known, that the man he was treating like a common criminal was Judge Marcus Vance, a man whose reputation for fairness and integrity was legendary. He hadn't known that the woman who had emerged from the passenger side, her voice a mixture of shock and outrage, was his wife, Supreme Court Justice Eleanor Vance. In that moment, standing on the side of a busy city street, with the red and blue lights of his patrol car painting a chaotic tableau on the faces of the gathering crowd, Michael Donovan had felt a sickening lurch in his stomach. He had crossed a line he hadn't even known existed, and as he'd stared into the eyes of the woman he had just assaulted, he'd seen not fear or anger, but a profound and devastating disappointment. It was a look that would haunt his dreams for years to come, a silent testament to the catastrophic failure of his judgment. The blue line, the legacy he had been so proud to carry, suddenly felt like a lead weight, dragging him down into a darkness from which he wasn't sure he would ever emerge. Judge Eleanor Vance was no stranger to the weight of expectation. From the moment she had stepped into her first law school classroom, a young black woman in a sea of predominantly white, male faces, she had understood that she would have to be twice as good, twice as smart, twice as prepared as her peers just to be considered their equal. It was a burden she had carried with a quiet, unyielding grace, her determination a silent fire that had fueled her rise through the ranks of the legal profession. She had clerked for a federal judge, made partner at a prestigious law firm, and been appointed to the bench, each step a testament to her fierce intellect and unwavering commitment to justice. Her husband, Marcus, had been her rock, her confidant, her unwavering champion. They had met in law school, two bright, ambitious souls drawn together by a shared passion for the law and a deep, abiding love for each other. He had celebrated her triumphs, soothed her doubts, and stood by her side as she had shattered one glass ceiling after another. His own career had been equally impressive, his appointment to the district court a source of immense pride for them both. They were a power couple, a force to be reckoned with, their home a sanctuary of intellectual debate and heartfelt laughter. The night of the incident, they had been on their way home from a charity gala, the soft strains of a string quartet still echoing in their ears. Marcus had been driving, his hand resting on her knee, a comfortable, familiar gesture that spoke of years of shared intimacy. They had been talking about their children, their grandchildren, the future they were so eagerly looking forward to. And then, in the blink of an eye, their world had been shattered by the flashing lights of a police cruiser and the raw, unbridled aggression of a young, inexperienced officer. Eleanor had watched in disbelief as the officer, his face a mask of anger and suspicion, had pulled her husband from the car. She had seen the flash of fear in Marcus's eyes, a fear that had nothing to do with guilt and everything to do with the color of his skin. And when the officer had shoved him against the car, a guttural, almost primal sound of protest had escaped her lips. She had gotten out of the car, her voice shaking with a mixture of rage and disbelief as she had identified herself, her title, her position. But the officer, his eyes wide and unseeing, had seemed to look right through her. And then, he had laid his hands on her, his touch a violation that had seared itself into her memory. The aftermath had been a blur of flashing cameras, shouted questions, and the cold, sterile environment of a police station. She had given her statement, her voice a low, steady monotone that belied the storm of emotions raging inside her. She had been professional, composed, every inch the Supreme Court justice she was. But later that night, in the privacy of their home, the facade had crumbled. She had stood in front of the mirror, her reflection a stranger with haunted eyes and a trembling lower lip. She had seen the red marks on her arm where the officer had grabbed her, a physical manifestation of the invisible wounds that had been inflicted upon her spirit. The lawsuit had been Marcus's idea. He had been a man of action, a man who believed in the power of the law to right the wrongs of the world. He had seen the incident not as a personal attack, but as a symptom of a much larger disease, a disease of prejudice and systemic bias that had infected the very institutions that were supposed to protect and serve. He had wanted to send a message, to create a precedent, to ensure that what had happened to them would never happen to anyone else. And so, with a heavy heart, Eleanor had agreed. The trial had been a grueling ordeal, a public airing of their pain and humiliation. Eleanor had taken the stand, her voice clear and strong as she had recounted the events of that night. She had looked at the young officer, at the fear and confusion in his eyes, and had felt not hatred, but a profound and aching sadness. She had seen in him not a monster, but a product of a system that had failed him, a system that had armed him with a gun and a badge, but had not equipped him with the wisdom and compassion to wield them responsibly. As she had spoken, she had felt the weight of her ancestors on her shoulders, the countless men and women who had endured far worse indignities with a courage and resilience that had humbled her. She had spoken not just for herself, but for them, for the generations of Black Americans who had been brutalized, marginalized, and denied the basic human dignity that was their birthright. And as she had finished her testimony, a hush had fallen over the courtroom, a silence so profound that it had seemed to suck the very air from the room. It was the sound of a truth that could no longer be denied, a truth that had been spoken with a quiet, unshakable dignity that had resonated in the hearts of all who had heard it. The gavel's echo, she knew, would be heard far beyond the walls of that courtroom. The first time Michael Donovan held his badge, it felt impossibly heavy. It was more than just a piece of polished metal. It was a symbol, a promise, a tangible link to a legacy of service and sacrifice. He remembered the pride in his father's eyes at the academy graduation, the firm handshake, the gruff, "Make us proud, son." He had pinned the badge to his chest, the weight of it a comforting, constant reminder of the oath he had taken. He was a protector, a guardian, a thin blue line between order and chaos. Now that same badge felt like a brand, a mark of shame that he couldn't escape. The trial had stripped him bare, exposing his every flaw, his every prejudice, to the harsh, unforgiving glare of public scrutiny. The media had painted him as a monster, a racist, a thug in a uniform. He had received death threats, his family had been harassed, and his name had become a byword for police brutality. The blue line, the brotherhood he had once held so dear, had offered a cold and distant comfort. He was a liability, a public relations nightmare, a stark reminder of the department's failings. He had been placed on administrative leave, a euphemism for being cast adrift in a sea of uncertainty and self-recrimination. He spent his days in a self-imposed exile, the silence of his small apartment a deafening roar in his ears. He replayed the incident with Judge Vance over and over in his mind, a torturous, never-ending loop of his own catastrophic failure. He saw the flash of fear in her husband's eyes, the shock and outrage on her face, the contempt in the eyes of the onlookers. He saw the man he had become, a man he didn't recognize, a man he despised. His father, a man of few words but deep convictions, had tried to reach him. He had sat across from Michael in the sterile, impersonal visiting room of the precinct, his face etched with a pain that Michael had never seen before. "We're not perfect, son," he had said, his voice thick with an emotion that Michael couldn't quite decipher. "We make mistakes, but it's what we do after the mistake that defines us." But the words had offered little comfort. How could he atone for a mistake that had shattered so many lives, including his own? The $10 million judgment had been the final crushing blow. It was a sum so vast, so astronomical, that it had ceased to have any real meaning. It was a symbol, a public declaration of his worthlessness, a life sentence of debt and shame. He had lost his job, his reputation, his future. He had become a pariah, a ghost in his own life. One evening, unable to bear the suffocating silence of his apartment any longer, he had found himself driving aimlessly through the city streets. He had ended up in a part of town he had once patrolled, a neighborhood that had once been a landscape of potential threats but now felt like a foreign country. He had parked his car and started to walk, his hands shoved deep in his pockets, his head bowed against the cold night air. He had walked past the boarded-up storefronts, the graffiti-scarred walls, the flickering neon signs of the corner bodegas. He had seen the faces of the people who lived there, faces he had once viewed with suspicion and distrust, and had seen in them not a threat, but a shared humanity. He had seen the tired eyes of the single mother juggling groceries and a crying baby, the weary shoulders of the old man sweeping the sidewalk in front of his shop, the hopeful, defiant graffiti on a brick wall that read, "We are here." He had ended up at a small community basketball court, the rhythmic thump of a ball on pavement, a steady, almost hypnotic sound. A group of teenagers were playing, their laughter and shouts a stark contrast to the silence that had consumed him. He had stood in the shadows, watching them, and had felt a pang of something he hadn't felt in a long time, a sense of connection, of belonging. He had seen in their faces not the hardened criminals his training had taught him to expect, but the faces of boys on the cusp of manhood, full of life and energy and a raw, untamed potential. One of the boys, a tall, lanky kid with a shy smile, had noticed him standing there. He had dribbled the ball over to the edge of the court, his eyes curious. "You want to play, man?" he had asked, his voice friendly, unassuming. For a moment, Michael had been tempted to say yes, to lose himself in the simple, uncomplicated joy of the game. But the weight of his badge, the invisible brand on his soul, had held him back. He had shaken his head, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. "No thanks," he had said, his voice hoarse from disuse. "I'm just watching." He had turned and walked away, the sound of the bouncing ball a fading echo in the night. It was the echo of a life he might have had, a life he had thrown away in a single catastrophic moment of anger and prejudice. The weight of the badge, he was beginning to understand, was not in the metal itself, but in the choices you made while wearing it. Eleanor Vance had always been a private person, her emotions a closely guarded secret that she rarely shared with the outside world. But the trial had changed that. Her pain, her humiliation, her vulnerability had been laid bare for all to see. She had become a symbol, a reluctant icon in the ongoing struggle for racial justice. Her face was on the cover of magazines, her name a trending topic on social media, her story a rallying cry for activists and advocates across the country. She had received an outpouring of support, letters and emails from strangers who had been moved by her story, who had seen in her their own struggles, their own pain. They had shared with her their own experiences of prejudice and discrimination, their own encounters with a justice system that had so often failed them. Their stories were a heartbreaking testament to the deep, festering wounds of a nation that had yet to fully reckon with its past. Eleanor read every letter, every email, her heart aching with a mixture of sadness and gratitude. She had not asked for this, had not wanted this, but she understood the responsibility that had been thrust upon her. She had been given a platform, a voice, and she was determined to use it to effect change. She started speaking at law schools, at community centers, at national conferences, her voice a powerful, unwavering call for reform. She spoke of the need for better training for police officers, for greater accountability, for a justice system that was truly blind. But the public persona, The strong, resilient, trailblazing judge was only part of the story. In the quiet moments, when the cameras were gone and the crowds had dispersed, the scars of her ordeal remained. She found herself flinching at the sound of a siren, her heart racing whenever she saw a police car in her rearview mirror. The sense of safety and security that she had once taken for granted had been shattered, replaced by a constant low-level anxiety that was as exhausting as it was debilitating. She had started having nightmares, vivid, terrifying dreams in which she was back on the side of that road, the officer's face a contorted mask of rage, his hands reaching for her. She would wake up in a cold sweat, her heart pounding, Marcus's arms a comforting, grounding presence beside her. He was her anchor in the storm, his unwavering love and support a balm to her wounded spirit. But even he couldn't fully comprehend the depth of her pain. The way the incident had fundamentally altered her perception of the world, of her place in it. One afternoon, she had been in her chambers preparing for a case when her clerk had brought her a letter. It was from Michael Donovan. Her first instinct was to throw it away, to not even open it. But something had stopped her. She had slit the envelope open with a trembling hand, her eyes scanning the neat, almost childlike handwriting. "Dear Judge Vance," the letter began. "I don't know if you will ever read this, but I feel compelled to write it anyway. I want to apologize. I know that word is inadequate, that it can never undo the harm that I have caused you and your husband. But I am sorry. I was wrong. I was arrogant. I was scared. I let my fear and my prejudice get the best of me, and I will live with the shame of that for the rest of my life." He went on to tell her about his upbringing, about the legacy of law enforcement in his family, about the pressures and expectations that had shaped him. He didn't offer it as an excuse, but as an explanation, a fumbling, heartfelt attempt to make sense of his own catastrophic failure. He told her about losing his job, about the death threats, about the crushing weight of the $10 million judgment. He told her about the night he had walked through the inner-city neighborhood, about the teenagers playing basketball, about the glimmer of hope he had seen in their eyes. "I don't know what the future holds for me," he wrote, "but I know that I can never be a police officer again. I am not worthy of that trust. I am trying to find a new path, a way to atone for what I have done. I am volunteering at a community center, working with at-risk youth. It's not much, but it's a start. I am trying to be a better man." Eleanor had read the letter twice, the tears streaming down her face. She had seen in his words not the monster the media had portrayed, but a broken, contrite young man who was struggling to find his way back into the light. She had seen in his pain a reflection of her own, a shared humanity that transcended the roles they had played in each other's lives. The scars they carried, she realized, were not so different after all. They were the scars of a broken system, of a society that had pitted them against each other, of a wound that would only begin to heal when they found the courage to see each other not as enemies, but as fellow travelers on a long and difficult road to redemption. The $10 million verdict had sent shockwaves through the city, a seismic event that had shaken the foundations of the police department and city hall. It was a staggering sum, a public indictment of a system that had allowed a young, inexperienced officer to wield his power with such reckless abandon. The mayor had held a press conference, her face a mask of grim determination, as she had promised sweeping reforms. The police chief had announced a top-to-bottom review of the department's training protocols and use-of-force policies. Task forces had been formed, committees had been convened, and a palpable sense of urgency had descended upon the city's political and law enforcement establishment. But for the men and women in blue, the verdict had a different, more personal meaning. It was a betrayal, a slap in the face, a sign that the city they had sworn to protect had turned its back on them. Morale plummeted, and a sense of fear and resentment began to fester in the ranks. Cops became more hesitant, more cautious, their every move scrutinized, their every decision second-guessed. The unwritten rule of the streets, the one that had always guided them, the one that said, "It's better to be judged by 12 than carried by 6, had been turned on its head. Now, it seemed, they were being judged by everyone all the time. Donovan's former partner, Henderson, had taken the news the hardest. He had seen the verdict as a personal attack, a repudiation of everything he had stood for, everything he had believed in. He had become withdrawn, sullen, his cynicism hardening into a bitter, all-consuming anger. He saw the world in black and white, in us versus them, and the line between the two had never been clearer. He had started taking more risks, pushing the boundaries, his frustration and rage a toxic cocktail that was poisoning his judgment. He had become a lone wolf, a renegade, his a cautionary tale whispered in the locker rooms and roll calls of the precinct. He was a man on the edge, a man who had lost his way, and it was only a matter of time before he took someone else down with him. The ripple effect of the verdict was felt far beyond the confines of the police department. In the inner-city neighborhoods that had for so long borne the brunt of police misconduct, the news was greeted with a mixture of hope and skepticism. For some, it was a sign that the tide was turning, that justice was finally within reach. For others, it was a hollow victory, a symbolic gesture that did little to change the harsh realities of their daily lives. The relationship between the community and the police, already fraught with tension and mistrust, had been stretched to the breaking point. At the community center, where Michael Donovan was now volunteering, the kids were abuzz with the news. They saw him as a celebrity, a hero, a man who had stood up to the system and won. They didn't know the whole story, didn't know the crushing weight of guilt and shame that he carried with him every day. They saw in him a reflection of their own struggles, their own aspirations, their own desire for a world in which they would be seen and heard and valued. Michael found himself in the strange, uncomfortable position of being a role model, a mentor, a guide. He listened to their stories, their dreams, their fears. He played basketball with them, helped them with their homework, and offered them a steady, non-judgmental presence in their often chaotic lives. He saw in them a resilience, a creativity, a raw, untamed potential that humbled and inspired him. He was learning more from them than they could ever learn from him. One of the boys, a quiet, thoughtful teenager named Jamal, had a particular gift for art. He would spend hours sketching in his notebook, his drawings a vivid, powerful expression of the world as he saw it. He drew pictures of his neighborhood, of his friends, of the cops who patrolled his streets. His drawings were not angry or hateful, but full of a raw, unflinching honesty. He drew the good and the bad, the hope and the despair, the beauty and the ugliness. One day, he showed Michael a drawing he had made of Judge Vance. He had captured her likeness with a startling accuracy, her eyes a mixture of strength and sadness, her face a portrait of quiet, unshakable dignity. Michael had stared at the drawing, his heart aching with a familiar pang of remorse. He had seen in Jamal's drawing not just the woman he had assaulted, but the woman he had failed to see, the woman whose humanity he had so casually and catastrophically disregarded. He had asked Jamal if he could have the drawing, and the boy had agreed, a shy smile lighting up his face. Michael had taken the drawing home and had pinned it to the wall of his small apartment, a constant, humbling reminder of the ripple effect of his actions. It was a reminder that every choice we make, every word we speak, every action we take, has consequences that extend far beyond ourselves, that ripple out into the world in ways we can never fully anticipate or comprehend. It was a lesson he was learning the hard way, a lesson that was being etched into the very fiber of his being, one painful, redemptive day at a time. Eleanor Vance sat in her favorite armchair, the late afternoon sun streaming through the window, casting a warm golden glow on the pages of the book in her lap. It had been months since the trial, months since she had received Michael Donovan's letter. She had not responded, not because she was angry or unforgiving, but because she hadn't known what to say. His words had touched her, had moved her in a way she hadn't expected. They had opened a door, a possibility, a path to a different kind of justice, a justice that was not about punishment, but about healing. She had been following the news, had read about the reforms that were being implemented in the police department, about the community outreach programs that were being launched, about the new emphasis on de-escalation and implicit bias training. She knew that real change was slow, that it was a long and arduous process, but she allowed herself to feel a flicker of hope, a sense that something good, something lasting, might come out of her pain. She had also been following the story of Michael Donovan. A journalist, intrigued by the young officer's fall from grace, had written a series of articles about his work at the community center. The articles were a poignant, humanizing portrait of a man who was trying to rebuild his life, to find a new sense of purpose, to atone for his past. They told the story of the basketball games, the homework sessions, the quiet, unassuming way he had earned the trust and respect of the kids he was working with. They told the story of Jamal, the talented young artist, and the drawing of Judge Vance that now hung on the wall of Michael's apartment. Eleanor had been deeply moved by the articles. She had seen in them a story not of a monster, but of a human being, a flawed, fallible, and ultimately redeemable human being. She had started to think about the $10 million, the symbolic victory that had felt so hollow. What if there was a way to turn that symbol into something real, something tangible, something that could make a real difference in the lives of the people who needed it most? She had talked to Marcus, had shared her idea with him, and he had, as always, supported her completely. He had seen the light in her eyes, the passion in her voice, and had known that she was on the verge of something extraordinary. And so, with his blessing, she had set in motion a plan that would once again send shockwaves through the city. She had called a press conference, the same room where she had once so bravely and painfully recounted the story of her assault. The room was packed with reporters, their cameras and microphones a silent, expectant audience. She had stood at the podium, her hands steady, her voice clear and strong. She had announced that she and her husband were forgiving the $10 million judgment against Michael Donovan. A collective gasp had rippled through the room, a sound of stunned disbelief. But she wasn't finished. She had gone on to announce that they were establishing a foundation that would be dedicated to bridging the gap between law enforcement and the communities they served. The foundation would fund scholarships for aspiring police officers from underprivileged backgrounds. It would support community-based art programs for at-risk youth, and it would create a forum for open and honest dialogue between cops and citizens. And in a move that had left the entire city speechless, she had announced that the foundation would be co-chaired by herself and Michael Donovan. The path to redemption, she had come to understand, was not a solitary one. It was a path that had to be walked together, with courage, with compassion, with a willingness to see the humanity in each other. It was a path that began not with a verdict, but with a conversation, not with a judgment, but with an act of grace. The foundation, she hoped, would be a first step on that path, a beacon of hope in a world that was so often shrouded in darkness. It was her offering, her legacy, her belief in the power of the human heart to heal, to grow, to be redeemed. The community center was buzzing with an energy that was palpable, a mixture of excitement, anticipation, and a healthy dose of teenage awkwardness. The walls, once a drab institutional beige, were now a vibrant kaleidoscope of color, covered in murals that depicted scenes of neighborhood life, of struggle, of resilience, of hope. At the center of it all was a stage, a makeshift platform that had been built by a group of volunteers, its backdrop a stunning, larger-than-life portrait of Judge Eleanor Vance, her eyes a beacon of strength and compassion. This was the official launch of the Vance Donovan Foundation, an event that had brought together a cross-section of the city that was as diverse as it was unlikely. Cops in uniform stood side by side with community activists. Politicians mingled with teenagers from the neighborhood. And at the center of it all, a testament to the transformative power of forgiveness, stood Eleanor Vance and Michael Donovan. Michael, dressed in a simple, well-worn suit, looked out at the crowd, his heart a chaotic symphony of gratitude, humility, and a profound, almost overwhelming sense of awe. He could hardly believe that this was his life, that he had been given this second chance, this opportunity to create a new legacy out of the ashes of his old one. He caught Eleanor's eye, and she gave him a small, reassuring smile, a silent acknowledgement of the incredible journey they had taken together. The event began with a performance by a group of spoken-word poets from the community center, their words a raw, powerful, and unflinchingly honest reflection of their lives, their dreams, their frustrations. They spoke of the fear and mistrust they felt towards the police, but they also spoke of their desire for a better future, for a world in which they would be judged not by the color of their skin or the zip code they lived in, but by the content of their character. Then Jamal, the talented young artist who had become the Foundation's first scholarship recipient, took the stage. He was nervous, his hands trembling slightly as he held up a new drawing, a companion piece to the one that hung on Michael's wall. It was a drawing of Michael, not as a police officer, but as a mentor, a friend, a man who was sitting on the edge of a basketball court, a look of quiet contemplation on his face. It was a portrait of a man in the process of becoming, a man who had found a new way to serve, a new way to protect, a new way to be a part of the community he had once so carelessly and catastrophically wronged. Finally, Eleanor and Michael took the stage together, the applause a thunderous, heartfelt roar that seemed to shake the very foundations of the building. They spoke not of the past, but of the future, of their shared vision for a city in which justice was not just a word, but a lived reality for all its citizens. They spoke of the power of empathy, of the importance of listening, of the courage it takes to see the world through someone else's eyes. As they spoke, a man in the back of the room, a man with weary, cynical eyes and a heart that had been hardened by years on the force, felt something shift inside him. It was Henderson, Michael's old partner. He had come to the event out of a sense of morbid curiosity, expecting to see a circus, a public relations stunt, a betrayal of everything he had ever believed in. But what he had found instead was something real, something authentic, something that had stirred a long-dormant hope within him. He had seen the faces of the kids in the crowd, the passion in Eleanor's voice, the quiet, humble strength in Michael's eyes, and he had realized that he had been wrong. He had been so wrong. The blue line, he was beginning to understand, was not a wall that separated them from the rest of the world, but a bridge that was meant to connect them. And for the first time in a long time, he felt a desire to walk across that bridge to see what was on the other side. The twist, the one that no one saw coming, was not in the forgiveness, not in the foundation, not in the unlikely partnership between a judge and the rookie cop who had assaulted her. The twist was in the quiet, almost imperceptible transformation of a single, hardened heart, a heart that had been touched by the contagious power of grace. The life lesson, the one that echoed in the rafters of the community center long after the speeches were over, was that true justice is not about winning or losing, but about healing. It's about the courageous, messy, and ultimately beautiful work of mending the broken places in ourselves and in our world. And that is a legacy worth fighting for. In the end, the story of Judge Eleanor Vance and Officer Michael Donovan reminds us of something painfully true and powerfully hopeful. Redemption isn't born in comfort. It's forged in the wreckage of our worst mistakes. What happened on that roadside could have ended in bitterness, division, and two lives scarred in opposite directions. But instead, it became the starting point of something rare and necessary. A conversation, a reckoning, a choice to see the human being on the other side of the hurt. Their journey, from a traumatic collision of fear and power to an unexpected partnership, shows what's possible when compassion replaces ego, when accountability opens the door to healing, and when courage means facing the truth instead of running from it. It's a story that lingers, a story that challenges us to be better than our instincts, to listen longer than we speak, and to believe that even when we break each other, we can still choose to rebuild. If this story moved you, made you think, or gave you even a small spark of hope, take a moment to like this video, share it with someone who needs it, and subscribe for more stories that stay with you long after they fade to black. Your support helps us tell the stories that matter, the ones that connect us, challenge us, and remind us of the humanity we all share. Thank you for watching.